By early 1945, the Pacific War had entered a phase defined by proximity. American forces were advancing toward the Japanese home islands, and operational decisions were increasingly shaped by what would be required to sustain pressure at the edge of logistical reach. In this context, the small volcanic island of Iwo Jima assumed an importance disproportionate to its size. From a planning perspective, the objective appeared straightforward: secure the island, neutralize its airfields, and remove a threat to long-range bombing operations while providing emergency landing sites for damaged aircraft. The landings were expected to be difficult, but once the beaches were taken and the island overrun, resistance was assumed to collapse in short order. What followed challenged that assumption. The island was seized, its airfields captured, and its perimeter secured. Yet the fighting did not end. Instead, resistance intensified and persisted, unfolding beneath the surface in a defensive system designed to absorb punishment rather than contest ground openly. Progress was measured not by distance advanced, but by the gradual reduction of a hidden, resilient network. The Battle of Iwo Jima was not defined by maneuver or breakthrough. It was shaped by preparation, engineering, and a deliberate rejection of conventional defensive patterns. Japanese forces did not seek to repel the landing. They sought to delay, inflict cost, and survive long enough to impose attrition disproportionate to the island's strategic value. Understanding why the fighting continued after the island was taken requires examining how expectations of collapse collided with a defensive doctrine built for endurance. Iwo Jima illustrates how control of terrain does not equate to control of resistance, and why in some battles, victory is achieved only after the battlefield itself has been methodically dismantled. The strategic value of Iwo Jima was defined less by its size than by its position within the operational geometry of the Pacific War. Located roughly midway between the Mariana Islands and the Japanese home islands, Iwo Jima sat astride the air routes used by American long-range bombers. For planners, its capture promised both the removal of a Japanese early warning outpost and the creation of emergency landing fields that could reduce bomber losses over Japan. From the American perspective, the operation fit within an established pattern. Amphibious landings, supported by overwhelming naval gunfire and air power, had succeeded across the Central Pacific. Resistance was expected to be intense during the initial assault, but once beachheads were secured and the island's limited depth exploited, organized defense was expected to collapse within a short time frame. This expectation rested on several assumptions. The island was small, lacked significant civilian infrastructure, and could not be reinforced once isolated. American planners believed that sustained bombardment, combined with numerical and material superiority, would exhaust defenders quickly. Control of the surface was expected to translate into control of the battle. Japanese defensive planning rejected these assumptions entirely. Rather than contesting the beaches, Japanese forces prepared a system designed to survive bombardment and deny the attacker a decisive moment. Defense was organized around depth, concealment, and endurance rather than visible resistance. The objective was not to hold territory in the conventional sense, but to impose maximum cost over time. The volcanic terrain of Iwo Jima made this approach viable. Beneath the surface, a network of tunnels, bunkers, and firing positions connected defensive zones and allowed movement without exposure. Positions were mutually supporting and designed to function independently if isolated. Destruction of one point did not degrade the system as a whole. This defensive concept altered the meaning of capture. Securing beaches, airfields, and high ground did not eliminate resistance. Each gain exposed additional positions, rather than resolving the fight. Progress became a matter of reduction rather than maneuver, requiring the systematic identification and neutralization of concealed defenses. From the outset, Iwo Jima was therefore not a battle for territory alone, but for the dismantling of a defensive system engineered to endure punishment. The expectation of rapid collapse reflected prior experience, but the conditions on Iwo Jima ensured that control of ground would not bring immediate decision. The opening phase of the battle confirmed that prior bombardment had not neutralized the island's defensive capacity. Despite days of naval and aerial strikes, Japanese positions remained largely intact beneath the surface. When American forces landed, they encountered limited resistance on the beaches, a condition that initially appeared to validate assumptions of weakened defense. This absence of immediate opposition was deliberate. Japanese defenders withheld fire until the landing force was densely concentrated and movement restricted by soft volcanic sand. Once units were exposed and momentum slowed, defensive fires were unleashed from concealed positions. The effect was not to repel the landing, but to disrupt organization and impose early casualties under conditions that limited rapid response. The terrain amplified these effects. Volcanic ash absorbed movement, vehicles bogged down, and natural cover was scarce. Units advancing inland were forced to bunch together, reducing flexibility and increasing vulnerability. Fire support was available, but targets were difficult to identify and suppress due to the depth and concealment of defensive positions. As American forces pushed beyond the beaches, the character of the battle became clear. Progress was measured in short distances, often requiring repeated attacks against positions that re-emerged after being suppressed. Japanese defenders allowed attackers to pass certain points, then engaged from the rear or flanks through tunnel exits that could not be easily sealed. The defensive system imposed a constant requirement for clearing and consolidation. Each advance demanded time for identification, coordination, and neutralization of resistance before further movement could occur. This slowed the tempo of operations and prevented the rapid exploitation that had characterized earlier island campaigns. Commanders quickly recognized that the battle would not follow an established pattern. The assumption that the island could be taken quickly after initial landings proved inaccurate. Control of surface features did not equate to control of the fight, and the destruction of visible defenses did not eliminate resistance embedded below ground. By the end of this phase, it was evident that Iwo Jima would not be decided by momentum or shock. The battle had transitioned into a systematic effort to dismantle a layered, concealed defense that was designed to function even after apparent defeat. As the battle progressed, the limits of firepower as a decisive instrument became increasingly apparent. Naval gunfire and aerial bombardment continued to be employed extensively, but their effects were constrained by the nature of the defensive system. Explosives destroyed surface features and collapsed some tunnel entrances, yet the core of the Japanese defense remained operational beneath the ground. American units were compelled to adapt to a form of combat defined by detection rather than advance. Identifying concealed firing points became as important as movement. Progress depended on small unit coordination, engineering support, and the methodical reduction of individual positions. This process consumed time and imposed a steady toll on personnel and equipment. The defensive doctrine employed by Japanese forces emphasized endurance and isolation rather than counterattack. Units were expected to hold positions independently, continue resistance even when surrounded, and exploit tunnel networks to reposition and re-engage. The absence of large-scale counterattacks reduced opportunities for decisive engagement while prolonging the battle. This approach forced American commanders to commit resources incrementally. Gains could not be exploited rapidly, as newly captured ground required thorough clearing to prevent renewed resistance. Each position eliminated revealed additional interconnected defenses, reinforcing the need for systematic reduction rather than rapid movement. The psychological effect of this environment was significant. Progress was slow, casualties accumulated steadily, and the enemy remained largely unseen. The lack of visible collapse challenged expectations shaped by earlier campaigns, where resistance tended to diminish once key objectives were secured. Logistics and rotation became critical factors. Sustaining continuous operations under these conditions required careful management of supply, replacement, and unit fatigue. The battle became a test of organizational endurance rather than tactical ingenuity. By this stage, it was clear that Iwo Jima could not be resolved through escalation of force alone. The battle demanded persistence, coordination, and acceptance that victory would be achieved only through the gradual dismantling of a defensive system designed to resist annihilation. As American forces advanced inland, the battle for Iwo Jima became increasingly defined by the requirement to eliminate resistance that could not be bypassed. The island's limited depth offered no room for maneuver, and every defensive position left intact threatened lines of communication and rear areas. Progress, therefore, depended on comprehensive clearance rather than selective engagement. Engineering units assumed a central role in this phase. Flamethrowers, demolition charges, and close-range infantry tactics were required to neutralize fortified positions embedded in rock and connected by tunnels. These methods were effective but slow, and they demanded close coordination under constant threat. Each position cleared represented a localized success, but not a reduction in the overall complexity of the defense. Japanese forces exploited this necessity. Defensive positions were designed to be abandoned temporarily and reoccupied through alternate tunnel routes. This allowed resistance to reappear in areas believed to be secured, forcing repeated clearing actions and increasing the burden on advancing units. The defensive system thus imposed continuous uncertainty and prevented the establishment of stable rear areas. Commanders adjusted tactics accordingly. Advances were shortened, consolidation became more deliberate, and emphasis was placed on sealing tunnel networks to prevent re-emergence of resistance. These adaptations improved control but further slowed the pace of operations. The battle evolved into a sequence of reduction tasks rather than a continuous advance. The cost of this method was cumulative. Casualties mounted not through large engagements, but through constant exposure to concealed fire. Fatigue became a limiting factor as units remained in contact for extended periods. Rotation and replacement were constrained by the island's confined space and the ongoing requirement to hold cleared ground. By this phase, the concept of capturing the island had lost operational meaning. While key terrain and airfields were under American control, the defensive system remained active. Victory could no longer be measured by territory taken, but by the gradual elimination of resistance within that territory. The battle's character was now fully defined. Iwo Jima was not a contest of movement, but of dismantlement. Each step forward required the removal of the system that sustained resistance, and that system had been engineered to make removal slow, costly, and unavoidable. By the middle phase of the battle, the cumulative effects of sustained pressure began to reshape the fight. American forces had secured the island's major surface features, yet resistance persisted across a shrinking but still lethal defensive network. The battle had moved from seizure to elimination, with success defined by the steady reduction of remaining positions rather than territorial gain. Operational control improved as lessons were applied at scale. Units integrated infantry, engineers, and supporting fires more tightly, sequencing actions to isolate, suppress, and destroy fortified points in a deliberate order. This method reduced surprise and limited re-emergence of resistance, but it demanded time and continuous coordination under fire. Japanese defensive capacity narrowed as ammunition stocks declined and tunnel networks were progressively sealed or collapsed. Positions that had once supported one another became isolated. Resistance continued, but its ability to influence adjacent sectors diminished as connectivity was broken and movement options were reduced. The attritional logic of the campaign now favored the attacker. Each cleared position permanently reduced the defensive system, while the defender lacked the means to restore it. The balance shifted not through dramatic breakthrough, but through accumulation. Progress was slow, but it was irreversible. Command emphasis during this phase centered on endurance and discipline. Commanders prioritized methodical clearance over speed, recognizing that incomplete reduction invited renewed losses. The tempo was set by the requirement to finish each task before moving on, ensuring that gains could be held without reopening the fight behind the lines. This phase clarified the purpose of the operation, later designated as Operation Detachment. The objective was not rapid conquest, but the removal of a threat through total neutralization. The cost was high, but the method aligned with the nature of the defense encountered. By the end of this period, the outcome was no longer in doubt, even though the fighting continued. The defensive system that had prolonged resistance was being dismantled, piece by piece. What remained was the final work of reduction, carried out under conditions that demanded persistence rather than expectation of sudden collapse. As resistance contracted into isolated pockets, the battle entered its final operational phase. What remained of the Japanese defense was no longer capable of coordinated action, but it continued to impose cost through localized, determined resistance. The nature of the fighting shifted from system-wide dismantlement to the elimination of individual strongpoints that could not be neutralized from a distance. American operations during this phase emphasized containment and exhaustion. Remaining positions were isolated, sealed, and reduced through deliberate methods rather than direct assault whenever possible. The objective was to prevent further casualties by denying defenders the opportunity to re-engage through surprise or maneuver within the tunnel network. Japanese forces, constrained by the loss of connectivity and supply, continued to resist in accordance with their defensive doctrine. Isolated units fought independently, often without communication or prospect of relief. Their actions no longer shaped the battle's outcome, but they prolonged its duration and increased its cost. Commanders recognized that no decisive moment would conclude the fighting. The end would come through completion rather than collapse. Operations were planned to ensure that each remaining pocket was addressed systematically, accepting that progress would be incremental and uneven across the island. The psychological burden of this phase was significant. For attacking forces, the absence of visible progress despite continued effort tested discipline and endurance. For defenders, resistance persisted beyond any strategic purpose, sustained by doctrine rather than expectation of effect. By this stage, Iwo Jima had ceased to function as a battlefield in the conventional sense. It had become a series of contained engagements, each resolved on its own terms. The conclusion of the battle depended not on breakthrough or maneuver, but on the exhaustion of all remaining capacity for resistance. The final phase underscored the defining reality of the campaign. Victory would arrive not with a single event, but with the completion of a process that left no defensive structure intact and no position capable of sustaining further resistance. The Battle of Iwo Jima produced lessons that extended beyond the island itself and shaped American understanding of how fortified defenses function under conditions of isolation. The campaign demonstrated that when an enemy rejects maneuver and concentrates on survival, conventional measures of progress lose relevance. Control of terrain does not equal control of resistance when the battlefield exists below the surface. For American planners, Iwo Jima clarified the limits of firepower as a tool for rapid decision. Naval and aerial bombardment inflicted destruction on an unprecedented scale, yet it could not neutralize a defense designed to absorb punishment and remain functional. Firepower remained essential, but it could not substitute for systematic clearance and close combat under these conditions. The battle also reinforced the importance of engineering and small unit integration. Success depended on coordination at the lowest levels, where detection, isolation, and reduction replaced maneuver as the dominant tasks. Iwo Jima highlighted how modern battlefields can force strategic outcomes to depend on tactical persistence rather than operational brilliance. From the Japanese perspective, the defense validated a doctrine built around attrition rather than territorial control. The objective was never to hold the island indefinitely, but to impose maximum cost and delay at the point of contact. That objective was achieved within the limits available, even though it could not alter the broader course of the war. Iwo Jima further influenced American assessments of future operations. The scale of casualties and the time required to eliminate resistance prompted serious reconsideration of assumptions about enemy collapse. The battle provided a concrete example of how prepared defenses could prolong fighting even after objectives were seized. Institutionally, the campaign became a reference point rather than a model. It was studied not for replication, but for warning. Iwo Jima showed what happens when an opponent designs a defense to deny decision, and what that implies for forces required to overcome it. The enduring significance of the battle lies in its exposure of a specific form of warfare. When resistance is engineered for endurance rather than maneuver, victory becomes a matter of completion, not breakthrough, and the cost of completion becomes the defining variable. The Battle of Iwo Jima concludes as a demonstration of how modern warfare can resist decision, even after apparent success. The island was taken, its airfields secured, and its surface controlled. Yet the fighting continued because the decisive element of the battle was never territorial control. It was the destruction of a defensive system designed to survive loss of ground and function under isolation. Iwo Jima showed that expectations shaped by previous victories can mislead when conditions change. Prior island campaigns encouraged the belief that resistance would diminish once key objectives were seized. On Iwo Jima, that logic failed. The defense had been constructed specifically to deny the attacker a moment of collapse and to convert superiority into prolonged effort. The battle clarified the limits of speed, shock, and firepower when facing prepared depth defense. Bombardment created destruction, but not decision. Momentum produced exposure, but not resolution. Victory emerged only through the systematic elimination of every remaining position capable of resistance, regardless of scale or visibility. For American forces, Iwo Jima became a benchmark for understanding cost under worst-case conditions. It demonstrated what was required to defeat an opponent committed to endurance rather than maneuver, and it forced a reassessment of assumptions about future operations against similarly prepared defenses. For the Japanese defense, the battle achieved its doctrinal purpose within strict limits. Resistance imposed delay and cost disproportionate to the island's size, but it could not alter the strategic trajectory of the war. Endurance extended the fight, but it did not create leverage beyond the battlefield. The broader lesson of Iwo Jima lies in its exposure of a fundamental principle. Control of ground does not end a battle when resistance is structured to survive beneath it. Victory in such conditions is not a moment, but a process, measured by completion rather than collapse. Iwo Jima endures not because of symbolism alone, but because it defines the point at which warfare becomes an exercise in dismantling systems, rather than defeating formations. It remains a reminder that some battles cannot be ended quickly, regardless of power applied, and that the cost of ending them is determined by how resistance is designed.